Destroy is the right word, held with the right understanding. Not destruction in the aggressive sense, not the deliberate, directed dismantling of another person's self-concept through confrontation or cruelty or the strategic deployment of insight as a weapon. The super empath does not set out to destroy anything. The destruction is a side effect, the natural structural consequence of a specific quality of presence, meeting a specific quality of ego that was built from the beginning on foundations that could not survive genuine encounter with the thing the super empath simply, without effort or intention, is. The avoidance ego is not what it presents as. This is the first thing that needs to be understood, because the presentation is convincing enough that most people, including the avoidant themselves, mistake the presentation for the substance. The ego presents as self-sufficiency, as the composed, capable, requiring nothing from anyone independence of someone who has their interior life so thoroughly ordered that the ordinary human needs for validation, reassurance, and the continuous relational maintenance that most people require are simply not present. The presentation is of someone who is, in the most fundamental sense, enough for themselves. The substance underneath is more fragile. Not fragile in the sense of being easily wounded by ordinary criticism or social friction. The avoidant is often genuinely resilient in those domains. Fragile in the specific, structural sense of being dependent for its maintenance on the continuation of a particular dynamic. The ego's self-sufficiency narrative requires, for its ongoing plausibility, the confirmation that comes from being the less invested party, the more independent presence, the one whose need is demonstrably lower than the other person's need, the one who could leave first or stay half in without significant cost, because the other person's investment is creating the asymmetry that the self-sufficiency narrative depends on. The super empath, simply by existing as they exist, removes this confirmation. The super empath does not need the avoidant in the way the avoidance ego requires to be needed. This is the first and most foundational disruption. Not because the super empath does not want the avoidant, the wanting is present, genuine, fully felt, but the wanting does not arrive as need in the operational sense. It does not generate the dependency, the anxious orientation, the specific quality of investment exceeding return that the avoidance ego has learned to recognize and position itself against. The avoidance ego, throughout the relational history, has functioned by occupying the position of the less needing party, by being the one whose emotional investment, while genuine, was demonstrably more contained than the other person's, by maintaining, through the specific calibration of their engagement, the asymmetry that confirmed the self-sufficiency narrative. I need less. I am more independent. The other person's greater need demonstrates, by contrast, the adequacy of my own self-containment. The super empath's presence removes the contrast. Not through any action directed at the asymmetry. The super empath is not trying to demonstrate their own self-sufficiency or to compete with the avoidance independence. They are simply, genuinely, actually self-sufficient in a way that requires no performance and no maintenance. Their groundedness is constitutional. Their wholeness does not have a gap that the avoidance engagement is filling. Their need, whatever form it takes, is not the operational need that the avoidance ego was calibrated against. And without the contrast, without the other person's greater need to position against, the avoidance self-sufficiency narrative loses the external confirmation it has been, without the avoidant fully realizing it, depending on to sustain itself. The ego looks around for the asymmetry that confirms its position. The asymmetry is not there. The super empath is standing in a fullness that is not less than the avoidance. That is, in fact, arguably greater. Not as a competitive achievement, but as the simple, non-performed reality of someone who has a more complete and more settled relationship with their own interior than the avoidance management has ever permitted. The super empath sees the performance. This is the second disruption, and it is more intimate and more threatening to the avoidance ego than the first, because the ego's self-sufficiency narrative is not only maintained through the external contrast with other people's greater need, it is maintained through the ongoing belief that the performance is being received as substance, that the self-sufficiency being presented is the self-sufficiency being seen. The super empath does not receive the performance as substance. Their perceptiveness, genuine, involuntary, operating below the level of analytical thought as the direct sensing of what is actually present beneath the surface of what is being presented, reaches through the performance with a specificity and a certainty that the avoidance usual management strategies were not designed to address. They see the fear beneath the composure, the need beneath the self-sufficiency, the longing beneath the indifference, the full, complicated, unmanaged interior of a person who has been working very hard for a very long time to ensure that interior remains invisible. And they see it without making the seeing a confrontation, without turning the perception into an accusation or a challenge or the kind of pointed observation that would give the avoidant something to defend against. The seeing is simply present in the quality of the super empath's engagement, in the specific way they respond to the person rather than the performance, in the subtle but unmistakable evidence that what the avoidant is presenting is not what the super empath is relating to. This is profoundly disorienting for the avoidance ego, because the ego's continued function requires, in part, that the performance be received as complete, that the self-sufficiency be believed, that the managed version of the avoidant be the version that the world is relating to. The super empath is relating to someone else, to the actual avoidant, the unmanaged one, the interior person whose existence the performance was designed to obscure. And being related to as the actual self, rather than the presented self, is, for the avoidant whose ego is built on the successful maintenance of the performance, the specific, targeted, entirely involuntary destruction of the ego's most fundamental claim, the claim that the performance is working, the claim that what is being seen is what is being presented, the claim that the interior, the fear, the need, the longing, is successfully concealed. The super empath's simple, quiet, entirely unkind seeing of through the performance is the evidence that the claim is false. And the ego built on a false claim, when the falseness becomes undeniable, does not simply adjust. It destabilizes, not dramatically. The avoidance ego does not collapse in a single visible moment of revelation, but structurally, in the foundational, weight-bearing way of something whose load-bearing element has been quietly, thoroughly, irreversibly compromised. The super empath does not react to the avoidance ego-protective behaviors in the way the ego requires to sustain itself. This is the third disruption, and it is the most consistently operative across the duration of the connection, because the avoidance ego does not only maintain itself through the establishment of contrast and the successful concealment of the interior, it also maintains itself through the responses it generates in other people. The withdrawal that produces the pursuit, the distance that produces the longing, the withholding that produces the reaching. Each of these responses, arriving reliably from the people the avoidant has been in connection with, confirms the ego's position, confirms that the avoidant is the one whose engagement others are working for, whose approval others are seeking, whose approach others are waiting for. The ego is maintained, in significant part, by being the destination that other people are oriented toward. The super empath is not oriented toward the avoidant in this way. They are oriented toward their own life, their own becoming, their own genuine fullness, with the avoidant as a welcome presence within that orientation rather than the organizing center of it. The withdrawal does not produce the pursuit. The distance does not produce the longing that the distance was designed to generate. The withholding does not produce the reaching that the ego was, however unconsciously, counting on to confirm its position. And the ego, without these confirmations, without the reliable production of the other person's pursuit to confirm its desirability, without the reliable arrival of the other person's longing to confirm its centrality, begins to encounter something it has rarely encountered in its relational history. the specific, disorienting experience of not being the most powerful presence in the dynamic. The super empath, simply by being fully oriented toward their own life, by refusing the orbit that the avoidance ego expects other people to adopt, becomes, without trying, without competing, without any action directed at the ego's position, the more powerful presence, not through dominance, through the specific, quiet, entirely genuine power of someone who does not need to be the destination, who has their own destination, who is moving toward it with the full commitment of their energy and attention. And the ego, designed to be the destination, encounters the specific, unprecedented, thoroughly humbling experience of not being the most compelling thing in the room. The destruction of the ego is not the goal. The super empath has no investment in the avoidance ego or its status. They are not tracking the avoidance reaction to their presence. They are not monitoring for the signs of disruption. They are simply being who they are, fully, consistently, without modification for the avoidance comfort or the avoidance ego's requirements. The destruction is simply what happens when the ego built on false foundations, on external confirmations, on the successful maintenance of a performance, meets a presence that provides none of the confirmations, sees through the performance, and refuses the orientation that the ego requires to sustain itself. The ego does not survive the encounter intact, not because it was attacked, because it was, for the first time, genuinely seen. And what was seen, the fear beneath the self-sufficiency, the need beneath the indifference, the longing beneath the distance, was not the self-sufficient, needing nothing, entirely self-contained person the ego had been, with considerable effort and considerable cost, claiming to be. The super empath did not destroy the ego destroyed itself, in the specific, inevitable way of all things built on foundations that a single genuine encounter with something real was always going to be enough to bring down.